We're delighted to be holding this keynote speech by Pascal Lamy, and delighted to be doing it in partnership with the City of London. We have Jeremy Browne here, the special representative of the city to the EU and former minister, so thanks very much indeed for that. Pascal needs very little introduction, particularly in talking about this well-titled subject of trade, the WTO and Brexit, but he was, among many other things, as you all know, the Director General of the WTO from 2005 to 2013. And also before that, the EU's Commissioner on Trade and indeed Chef de Cabinet for Jacques Delors. And when I asked him how to describe his current role, he said, oh, zillions of things in European and indeed a bit in the French scene. We're delighted to have him here. He's going to talk for about 20-25 minutes on his views on these three questions. We're going to have a brief discussion here, but I know that there are indeed zillions of questions among all of you out there, and so we'll go pretty rapidly to questions. With that, Pascal, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for this short introduction. Thanks to the Institute for Government for this invitation. We obviously tried, when we decided to have this conversation a few months ago, we tried to reach the day when Article 50 would be triggered. We still have roughly 12 hours ahead of us, so maybe it will work. Let me try and give you enough of an overview, trying to remain as objective as possible, which is not a lot, I'm afraid to say, for obvious reasons which I think everybody will understand. But in order to trigger a bit of a conversation, both with this panel and with you in the audience. Now, what do we know about Brexit? What do we not know about Brexit? And roughly, what's the cockpit view of issues to come? Starting with what we know, of course, we know the wording of Article 50, insofar as it is clear. We know the result of the vote in June, and we know what we've learned since. And what we've learned since is, one, that hard Brexit is the only option, notably because of these clear constraint on the UK side on no more free circulation and no more competence for the EU Court of Justice. It's the only option on the UK side for political reasons, because it's probably the only way for the Prime Minister to keep her party united between those who do not care about the bill and those who believe that when the real bill will appear, there might be a conversation. But in the meantime, they both agree that hard Brexit is the right scenario. Same on the continent, for obvious reasons, which is that all European continent leaders do not want a situation where there will be a sort of easy way out, given the pressure they're under, for some of them, by not only Eurosceptic but anti-European movements. So, it's the only option. And what we've also learned, which probably was not that clear at the time of the referendum, is that both sides have a very strong political mandate. On the UK side, there's nothing like serious opposition, as we've seen by the vote in the Parliament. And on the continent side, there's nothing like any disagreement or hint of a disagreement between the 27 member states. Michel Barnier, who's been put in charge of this negotiation for the Commission, has done his prep work, and he has in his pocket a mandate which he will put to the Council the moment the British Prime Minister triggers Article 50, and this mandate is extremely clear, already cooked, and without any serious problem within the 27, which was not a pre-done conclusion. And the last thing we know, I think, but it may be more a matter of judgment, is that it will take time. Why will it take time? Because separating an egg from an omelette is a complex operation, which entails probably 100 of small steps. Some of these steps can be easy, but many of them are very complex, and again, complexity in negotiations means time. On top of that, we also know that on the UK side, and this was to be expected, there is a capacity issue because the UK has to build the necessary capacity to negotiate not only trade, many other issues, and I'll come back to that later, but it takes time before you get the expertise to handle these sort of things. Now, that's roughly what we know, which of course leaves open lots of things we don't know. Among which the exact meaning of Article 50, when it says the terms of divorce separation will be negotiated, taking into account the framework of the future relationship, whatever that means. It's typical Diplo language. Sorry for a few of you here who've been extremely good at fudging this sort of issue with clever words that mean something on one side and maybe something a bit different to the other side. But of course, interpreting what taking into account a framework is already something which needs enormous intellectual imagination and expertise. What we do not know is what separation proper will be about, and what beyond separation proper will have to be negotiated. Although I would think, but that's only my view, that separation proper will have to focus on two main issues. First one is the rights of EU citizens on both sides of the channel. You roughly have 5 million European citizens, some on this side, some on the other side, whose rights to free circulation, to receive pension from other member states and so on, will have to be determined and probably grandfathered, as we say in trade terms, with probably they remain with the rights they have until a cut-off date, which may be the date of triggering Article 50, and a different regime for the future. The second probable big issue for the separation discussions are financial obligations. You know the numbers which the media have floated, somewhere between 40 billion euros and 60 billion euros. No doubt there's some room for compromise between 40 billion euros and 60 billion euros, assuming these are the two proper ends of on the top and on the minimum. What we do not know, of course, and that matters, is the timing of this whole process. What we know is that Article 50 gives a 2-year period, which is unlikely to be extended, although there is a possibility to do that by unanimity, both among the 27 and on the UK side. But many of us, including me, believe that there's no way removing the egg from the omelette can be done in 2 years. So it will take more time, which means that we will need some sort of fix, whether we on the continent call it continuation clause, whether you on the UK side call it a transition clause, because I think it would be better to call it on your side transition and on our side a continuation, but that's just a diplomatic suggestion. It's already fine-tuning, but what's for sure will be necessary is a period where things will not be settled that goes beyond the 2 years of Article 50. Another thing we do not know, and on which lawyers have already started exercising their immense imagination, although with a lot of controversy, which is what lawyers like, which is whether once triggered Article 50 could be de-triggered. Whether once you've done that, at some stage, no, we stop and wait or remove, or this is totally unclear, but it's intellectually extremely interesting. Now, why will all this take time? And that's my third and last point. Because if you look at the complete view of the menu and what will need to be discussed and agreed, it's absolutely huge. And for the sake of simplicity and to the risk of hyper-simplicity, let me give you a few examples in 3 baskets. Things which are relatively simple, things which are more complex, and things which are really complex. In the relatively simple, and it might surprise many of you, is establishing a free trade agreement for goods between EU 27 and UK. Very simple, zero tariff, so that supply chains which are intricated between the continent and the United Kingdom do not suffer. Easy, no-brainer, a little bit of a problem for agriculture, depending on how the United Kingdom supports its farming system after exit, and a few complexities on rules of origin, because whatever free trade agreement other than the internal market needs the goods which you import, even if it's zero tariff, your good needs a passport so that you know it originates where you have a free trade agreement and not from a place on this planet where you don't have a free trade agreement. So assuming we have a total free trade agreement, but UK has no free trade agreement, or we, Europeans, do not have a trade agreement with Laos, a good coming from Laos into the UK will have to be checked whether it comes from Laos to the UK, and how much does UK add to this value entails a whole complexity of rules. But let's assume this is doable, simple. Another thing which is very simple, in my view at least, although if you read the press it's a bit complex, it's the UK exiting the WTO EU club. A simple solution is for UK to exit the EU in the WTO in the same terms as the one it had as an EU member in the WTO. Simple. A little possible complexity on quotas, for instance, because EU has negotiated quotas for Hilton beef, and the quota for importing Hilton beef from the US is an EU quota. So it will have to be translated into a British quota and a EU 27 quota. Not that complex, you just have to look at the statistics of who imports and who eats How much Hilton beef in the UK? Not a big thing. Bit of a problem with numbers, but simple. Another thing which is reasonably simple is that one can expect that the UK will keep the same trade regime outside the EU as the one it had as a member of the EU with countries who have signed free trade agreements with EU. At least at the beginning, that's something to be expected, although one could say, yeah, but if I'm Japan and I have concluded a free trade agreement with EU, I've concluded a free trade agreement with 500 million people, consumers. So what I have given for that, which is the market access into Japan, which I have considered for that, I won't get that with your 65 million people. So maybe I'll ask for a rebate. Maybe, but let's assume people are reasonably pragmatic. Again, that's among the simple things. And among things which might look complex, but which could turn very simple, are, for instance, fisheries. At first sight, it's a nightmare, because fish don't vote. They haven't heard about the result of the referendum. And when they cross the territorial waters, there is no bell that says, "Ooh, stop." So, at first sight, looks very complex, very sensitive politically. But let's assume we sign a deal, which is we keep our mutual access. British fishermen will access EU waters. EU fishermen will access British waters. That's what we have for the moment. The only little complexity, but it's a little complexity, is that, of course, we will have to keep the same conservation principles. It's a little detail, but it's essential, because without the same conservation disciplines, nobody will access these free fish zone. Another area, as an example, which is relatively simple, is things like Erasmus, for instance. One can think, and many of us on the continent have been told that lots of people want to keep this student exchange program, which has a bit of a cost, but again, probably doable. So let's move to things which are a little more complex, like trade defense, for instance. Anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, safeguard clauses, which is a permanent instrument of trade policy. When I was EU Trade Commissioner, half of my staff at DG Trade was dealing with trade defense. The other half is dealing with market access issues. And by the way, if you look at the WTO court case record, half of the WTO court cases are about trade defense, and the other half about normal market access issues. So that's very complex, not least because you need a formidably expert task force to handle anti-dumping cases. Now, can the UK afford to do that? Not sure. It might outsource it to McKinsey, possibly, probably at a very high cost. But this is something that starts being complex. Public procurement. Let's assume we have a free trade agreement. How much of our public procurement is open? In which sectors? Do we keep it totally open? Do we do some restrictions here and there? Big deal in terms of trade flows. Environment issues, climate change, CO2 standards, and, for instance, whether UK will keep participating in the European trading schemes for emission permits. It's not directly a trade issue, but whether you participate or not in a system like that with obligations is something which is complex. Another area of relative complexity will be competition law and its enforcement. Do we have the same competition standards for dominant positions, for mergers and acquisitions? How do we enforce this? Is it going to be done under the jurisdiction of UK courts? What if UK courts and EU courts have a different view on whether a acquisition is or not reducing competition? That's a whole universe of open questions. And lastly, and again I want to remain short and simple, everything around the European research area. Today, one of the areas where EU is a real EU, and it's not that well known because it's more for specialists and experts, is research and innovation. The 80 billion pot of money which is in the EU budget is shared among members, including a big chunk for the UK, who benefits from its comparative advantage in research in science. Of course, Norway, Switzerland, even Israel are part of this European research area, but under conditions which have had to be negotiated tailor-made each time. And of course, negotiating with Switzerland is complex, as we all know, but negotiating with UK is much more complex, not least, again, because of the weight it has in science and innovation. Lastly, before I conclude, issues which are really very complex. Starting with technical standards. It's one thing to have a zero tariff, zero quantitative restriction, duty-free, quota-free, but what you export on the market has to match a number of precaution standards, safety, security, food, cars, lighters, toys, and so on. Roses, pesticide residues, aflatoxin in nuts, ractopamine in pork, I mean, a huge telephone book. And that's, of course, a major problem. Unless UK agrees, which, by the way, countries like Switzerland or Norway have done, after lengthy consideration and a bit of testing other possibilities, to systematically follow the continental standards. Let's recognize that politically it doesn't sound that great to exit for sovereignty reasons, but to have to keep the same standards, not having your say in the standard, because that will be the case if and when UK exits. So, brace for lots of inventions like mutual recognition, like convergence, like equivalence, and how equivalence can work and how is it tested. For sure, not to be done in 2 years, unless a simple solution like we will always match the EU standard, which I doubt would be politically palatable on this side. What is true for goods is even more true for services, because services are, for a variety of reasons, regulated. If you want to become an accountant, you have a sort of license. Telecoms is a regulated area. Not to talk about financial services, which I reserve for the conversation with the panel, which is an obvious problem, notably because of the huge competitive advantage the City of London has benefited from during the time it was the gateway, the financial gateway to the European continent. Taxation, of course. Indirect taxes, VAT. We have serious disciplines on VAT within the European Union. And given cross-border trade, we came quite early to the conclusion that VAT rates had to be within a relatively limited corridor. Would this be acceptable forever, for some time, under some conditions? Not to talk about corporate taxation, which, as we know, is not yet harmonized, but is in the process of someday being harmonized, which of course raises a whole lot of questions, not only, of course, on rates, but on the taxation base. IP protection, how much would IP generated in UK be protected on the continent or the other way around? A classical chapter in all trade negotiations since the last 20 or 30 years. A nest of problems. As we've seen, by the way, each time we've negotiated bilateral trade deals during the last 30 years. Finally, and just, again, not for the sake of being exhaustive, just to give you a small example of things which are very complex, Euratom. Euratom is one of the European communities which were merged at some site, but which is the agency that establishes and enforces nuclear safety standards. UK will exit Euratom. And when the question was raised at some stage in the internal UK process, the Prime Minister said, no, we have to exit Euratom also because otherwise there's a risk that we remain under the supervision of the EU Court of Justice, which would have been the case if UK had remained within Euratom. But of course, leaving Euratom opens totally your problem of what are your nuclear safety standards and how they are checked, enforced, where is the expertise, who does that? And it's a reasonably sensitive public topic to make sure that nuclear installations are safe. So that's, again, a very simple presentation of something which will be very difficult. And I think, having said that, what we can say, and what is my view on that, is that whatever deal we succeed in making, and I'm pitching for the best deal, the most open, most simple, most efficient, the most pragmatic, the greatest deal we can have, it's going to be complex and costly. In trade terms, just to take this example, there is no way switching from the internal market to any other regime, including the best, will be costly. Take the example of rules of origin. Rules of origin have a cost. If you need a passport for your good, you need the passport, you need the person that rubber stamps the passport, it has a cost. So it will be costly. And that's my conclusion. I think at this stage, the costs of this operation are not visible. People have said, oh, it's going to be apocalypse. No, it's not an apocalypse until now, and it probably will never be an apocalypse, by the way. But others have said, no, not only will it not cost, it will make savings. I think there is a more pondered opinion now on this issue. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that we are entering a sort of race with time. After all, and I recognize it is a non-objective interpretation, the British people decided to leave the European Union not for economic reasons, but for political reasons. And we are still at a stage where politics trump economics, and that's what opinion polls, that's what the behavior of political leaders tell us, fine for the moment. Given the time it will take, the big question, I think, and I have no answer to this question, is how much time will it take for the cost to appear, and whether, if these costs appear, this triggers or not a new balance between reason and passion at some stage. So, the biggest question, let's say, looking 10 years from now, there's one big question for us Europeans, the remaining 27, which is whether it's good or not for UK after 10 years. And this is something very important for us, because, I mean, we keep trying to integrate the European Union in the name that we do better together than alone. If UK exiting would to be the evidence, the proof that a country, be it UK, does it better alone than together, that would probably trigger a bit of reflection on the continental side. But this will not be anything like clear before 10 years from now. In the meantime, will at some stage the cost for the UK, hence the cost for the continent, anything that has a cost for the UK has a cost for the continent because of the deep intrication of our production systems. Will this cost appear when, and will this trigger a sort of new discussion? Unclear. Many of us hope so. I simply don't know. Thank you.
Pascal, thank you very much indeed for that. I will ask you a few questions, come to Jeremy to see what he thinks about it, and then go to the many questions that you all have in the room. Thank you for that, for this progression from the apparently simple to the complex, and indeed for your conclusion that it's going to be complex, permanently costly, an important point, and probably not an apocalypse. Let me start with a point that you raised right at the beginning and at the end. You said right at the beginning, you referred to a hard Brexit, and you took it in that meaning as really what the Prime Minister had said at the turn of the year, that look, we'll leave and we won't be part of the single market, and we probably won't be part of the customs union. But Brexit could be even harder than that. Obviously what people are looking at now as negotiations are about to begin is what if Britain simply walked out? How bad would that be for Britain and for the remaining 27?
Well, I mean, it would be worse than an agreement. Let's assume, for the simplicity of my answer, these 2 years lapse, no agreement, trade side, UK start trading with everybody and with the European Union under WTO terms. That's worse than a bilateral agreement. By definition, if we sign bilateral agreement, it's because they are better than the multilateral least common denominator. So anything that does not have an agreement will be more costly. Now, it will be more costly for you and for us. Because any cost for you has a cost for us. It may be in a proportion of 100 to 15, maybe, I mean, it depends on where and when. But if I take research, for instance, I cannot think of a situation where UK would exit the European research area and have a sort of bilateral agreement with MIT and Yale and Berkeley, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. So, I mean, Oxford, Cambridge are where they are, and there are centuries of cooperation and collaboration. So these things, I mean, cutting this would certainly be extremely damaging.
And we're talking really just about trade there, but of course what businesses say is trade and tariffs is the least of their worries.
Absolutely.
It's the regulation and the jurisdiction and the confusion about which jurisdiction you're working under that is almost top of their list.
Which is why, in my view, the tariff side is the simplest of all. Again, modulo rules of origin.
You said very bluntly what is people are gradually moving towards as a consensus that, look, 2 years is not enough time. And you've talked about, you offered us actually new vocabulary on this, a transition one. Actually, transition is toxic to some politicians here, particularly on the Brexit camp, because of the suspicion that a transition might stick. And in fact, implementation is the preferred euphemism at the moment, I think. But do you have a sense of how long it might take to do simply a trade deal? I'm not talking about all the other stuff.
5-6 years,
Okay.
roughly.
Thank you.
A comprehensive, not
comprehensive.
a small little thing.
Yeah.
And remember, which is something that strangely my good friend Peter Carl, who just published a very good piece in Friends of Europe, which is a good piece of technical advice. But what escaped his attention, I'm afraid, when he writes that you just have to do a goods deal, and then we'll see that this is not possible under WTO legislation. There is an Article 24 in the GATT-WTO agreement which says that you can discriminate, i.e. have more favorable terms of trade with a trade partner, provided you open essentially all trade. Whatever essentially all trade means, it is clearly not a trading goods only agreement. So a trading goods only agreement would be under threat of WTO litigation.
Could it make any sense to talk about separate terms for Scotland if Scotland were remaining within the within the UK?
I have to be careful not to step into this. Although,
You probably say nothing more controversial than what you said on fish, which is already pretty explosive.
as a Norman, I have a lot of affection for the Scots for obvious historical reasons. If there had to be something complex with the UK, and even more complex with Scotland, because it couldn't be the UK but couldn't be the normal regime, it would add complexity to complexity. The simple solution that comes to mind, if Scotland wants to remain in the European Union, is that, they vote their secession under their own terms and with your own debates, and then they re-enter under terms which will not be complex to negotiate, because that's the regime they have as a member of the United Kingdom, hence the EU.
Thanks. And just finally, you brought us at the end of your comments to this interesting question of whether British people might change their mind as the cost of this became apparent, or simply as time passed. And you referred right at the beginning to whether Article 50 might be reversible, even if we were in the process. But what is your view on that, if British people came to change their mind at some point in this process?
I would not bet on that. So if the question is, odds-wise, I think exit will take place. If I was obliged to take a bet today, put my money on one or the other, I would say it will happen. But if I'm a clever bettor, I'll look at how much money I will make if it happens, and I'll look at how much money I will make if it does not happen. So if I'm a rational, it will happen. If I want to make money, I'll bet it will not happen, because it might not happen.
Thank you for that. On that absolutely appropriate note, let me turn to the City of London. Jeremy,
comes to just betting on things.
Assessing the outcome.
Assessing
the outcome and risk.
Reward.
Jeremy, you've got this particular role at the moment for the City of London, but obviously it reaches deep into your past as a Foreign Office and Home Office Minister. Both departments are intimately affected by this process. Pascal has referred to the city as having huge competitive advantage, as the gateway to Europe. How does all this look, and how do Pascal's remarks look from your point of view?
Well, first of all, can I say thank you very much for a thoughtful and comprehensive speech, which I enjoyed listening to. Let me just make a couple of brief points, including on that one. The first is that maybe I say this partly as a former politician myself, but I don't think it is a compelling argument that a process is too difficult for administrators to dispatch, and therefore the politicians are going to have to disregard the result of the referendum. By which I mean that, no doubt, taking independence for India, there are countries in the European Union that used to be in the Soviet Union, decoupling the Czech Republic from Slovakia. All of these are, I imagine, very complicated tasks, but if the political will is there, then the administrators need to find a way of delivering those outcomes. So I hope we will approach this process once Article 50 is triggered with a can-do rather than a can't-do attitude, and that Britain will be intelligent in the way it seeks to understand and accommodate the European Union, but the European Union will respect the right of a member state to leave if that is the wish of that member state. And it shouldn't just be a theoretical possibility, it needs to be a practical possibility as well. And that means that we need to find the arrangements to give effect to the outcome of the referendum. In terms of the status of the City of London, but there is quite a lot of business that is dispatched and discharged in the city which is related to Britain's membership of the single market. There are businesses in the city that use it, if you like, as a sort of aircraft carrier off the shore of Europe and operate across the continent as a whole. And for some of those businesses that are quite exposed as a result of Brexit, this is a serious issue. But I think there is a danger of overstating the impact of Brexit on the City of London. And the City of London is a global financial centre on the continent of Europe, hosted by the United Kingdom, in effect. But most of the activity that happens in the City of London is of a global nature. It doesn't happen because of the benevolence of the European Union. The City of London isn't where it is because a committee in Brussels decided to allow it to be where it is. So I think there will be some adjustments as a result of Brexit, and functions that need to be delivered from within the single market will have to be delivered from another city once London is no longer within the single market. But some of the estimates, it's very hard to estimate this because there may be knock-on effects, but the estimates of the number of job losses that may result from Britain leaving the single market on the City of London is somewhere in the sort of 5, 6, 7% scale. Now it's quite a lot, but so is 93, 94, 95%. London is by many magnitudes the dominant financial centre on the continent of Europe. It's the only global scale on the continent of Europe. And if I have a single message as I travel around Europe, it's to try and encourage people across the EU to see the City of London as their asset, not just Britain's asset, and to nurture and value it accordingly, and to recognise that there will be, as I say, some adjustments as a result of Brexit, and that is reasonable and sensible. But trying to inflict additional harm on the City of London over and above those natural adjustments will be obviously unhelpful for the City of London, but counterproductive for the EU too. Can I add one tiny extra thing as an ex-politician? I get really nervous about this argument about whether we overturn the referendum result. I sort of end up thinking that this isn't a sort of rolling opinion poll where we have to say 1 month people want to leave and the next month they want to join again and the next month they want to leave again. I imagine if the Scots had voted to leave in 2014 they wouldn't be saying, well, maybe we'll actually change our minds. And I remember having a conversation with some UKIP activists, retired people, when I was a Member of Parliament. And they said, Jeremy, they said, the thing is, we'll never be given a referendum on whether we can leave the EU. And I said, well, maybe we will in time, if there's a political pressure builds up for that. And they said, well, the thing is, even if we ever got a vote on this, the politicians, the people in London would never actually let us leave. And I said, come on, we're an established, mature democracy. And they said, you're naive, young man. I was still quite young, I was having this conversation 5 years ago. They won't really let us leave. Even if we vote for it, us little people will be disregarded by the people who matter in London, and they just won't let us do it, even if we vote for it. And I went away thinking how sad, how little faith they had. And it does make me nervous, as a Democrat, I'm sort of departing a bit from my City of London responsibilities, as to whether they might have been right and I might have been wrong.
Thanks. Well, that's a whole separate debate about, as Pascal was saying, what happens when the costs become clear, and Parliament has many views on that. Let's go to questions. I'm going to take, let me take them in twos. There's a lot here and here.
Narina Hertz, ITV News. Mr. Lamy is a seasoned negotiator. Can you paint for us a bit of a picture of how hard the these negotiations are going to be in practice?
Thank you. And the next one.
My name is David Lee.
Excuse me, could you wait for
My name is
the
David Lee. I'm a
record?
Labour member of the House of Lords, and go back a long way with Jacques Delors, Pascal Lamy knows, and in those days it was very, very clear that we couldn't have globalisation and Europe was all of these freedoms, four freedoms, without looking after the bottom dog, people who are affected, people who feel insecure, and so on. Would Pascal like to comment on how he sees the angst in Europe at the moment, and are there practical things we can do about it that we're not doing about it?
Thank you very much. Pascal, do you want to start with that?
Yeah.
And Jeremy, I will come to you on that.
They're both.
On the first question, how hard depends on many, many parameters. And there is no easy negotiation by definition. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a negotiation. But it can be more or less aggressive, it can be more or less bumpy, it can be more or less sour, depending on politics first. Now, on politics, as I said, for the moment, the picture is extremely clear. Nobody in the UK is seriously contesting the mandate of Mrs. May, and nobody on the continent is contesting the mandate that is going to be given to the Commission, which is already it has in its pocket. So, and I think the spirit, at least from what I know on the EU side, is that we will try to have this as, limiting as much damage as possible. So this notion, which I keep reading in the tabloid press on this side, which I do not do too often, I must say, but that these people on the continent are going to punish us, and they are after us, and they're going. This is total crap. I'm sorry.
It is backed up by some statements exactly
absolutely no residence on the continent. Absolutely no residence on the continent. So, but the reason why it will be hard is because some of these things are horribly complex. And once you give to extremely loyal experts which have a deep knowledge of what their truth is, you confront them with other people who are as loyal, as well-intentioned, but deep breathing into their discipline. Look at WTO negotiations. So this is a wetland. And you sometimes just get drowned, which is not nice, by the way. So it's inevitably going to be hard. On your second question, Delors' view at the time was that, Delors was a classical Nordic, and still is, by the way, a classical Nordic social democrat. You have to streamline supply, open trade, level the playing field, knowing that this works because Mr. Ricardo theorized comparative advantage, Mr. Schumpeter theorized creative disruption. It works because it's painful because it works. The pain is on the weakest, so you need social systems to offset the increase of efficiency you give to the supply in growing your market, roughly. That's Delors' view. It's still my view, by the way. But what is true is that, especially during the last 10 years when the 2008 crisis came from over the Atlantic, this impression that it's balanced, that we open, we level, and that the costs of that are somehow taken into account has dwindled, has been eroded. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you have a sort of a normal feed into some Eurosceptic or even anti-European feeling on the continent. It's not that big. It's bigger than it was, and this is understandable, the EU hasn't delivered on prosperity and security for the last 10 years the way it did before. So it's understandable. I don't think it should be underestimated. I don't think it should be overestimated. It's probably too soon to draw any kind of general conclusion of yesterday's elections in the Netherlands, but it confirms what I've observed, and that's what you see when you look at polls. Brexit, and by the way, the election of Trump, have not been a big boost to anti-European or even anti-globalizers within the continent. It's more seen as, this is something dangerous.
Thanks. Jeremy, do you want to comment, particularly the second point, about what people are feeling about this on the continent? And we've, of course, had the results of the Dutch elections, where the forces of voices against immigration have done much less well than expected.
Well, I hope on the politics of that will give people within the EU 27 more confidence in the forthcoming discussions with the United Kingdom that there is not a charge for the exit door following the example of Brexit, and therefore they need not be unnecessarily defensive in terms of how they interact with the British government. I still think there is a big underlying issue about how capitalism and globalisation can work for the bottom quarter, the bottom third in society, but that is beyond the politics, if you like, the real impact on people's lives. In terms of the negotiations, I suppose the difference, I would defer to Mr. Lamy's considerable expertise, but I suppose the difference in this case is that most negotiations start with a dysfunctional relationship between the two parties, and over years and years of painstaking work try and make it functional. Whereas here we start with an entirely functional relationship, and the question is, how much dysfunctionality do the politicians wish to artificially inject into the relationship between the EU 27 and the UK? And if we can minimalise the dysfunctionality that is added, then we start with a healthy working relationship from the outset. Now, of course, that still leaves the issue of how we manage future divergence, but that would be an issue for the EU in its negotiations with any third party. And I wouldn't want the EU 27 to be in a position where they sought to have superior trade relations with every country in the world apart from Britain, where there was an active preference for having an inferior relationship. And the UK is the big economy on the continent of Europe that will not be in the EU, and I think it is in the mutual interest of both parties to try and reach a sensible accommodation. And I'm sitting in a room with Paisley and McGuinness on one wall and Mandela and de Klerk on the other. It can't be beyond the wit of man and politicians to try and find a cordial outcome, even if it appears difficult at the outset.
They've got our backs, their backs to us. Let's go here, and then in the middle, and then I'm coming to others.
I'm Diane Hayter. I'm the Shadow Minister for Brexit in the Lords. I found that, the basket's really helpful, and I think the only surprise I had was that Euratom was in your most complex basket. And I'd sort of assumed, because it seemed from all our discussions that there was a great willingness to keep that going, and some urgency, because even on Brexit Day +1, a lot of the Euratom needs to be there. So I wondered why you'd thought it was really that complex that you've put it right in that basket.
Great. And the next one was, I beg your pardon, a chap here with a yellow tie. I do beg your pardon, sorry. It's been very patient.
Sorry, the question doesn't connect very well with the previous one, but it has been suggested by some economists that what the UK should do in the event of there being no deal, or a deal they weren't happy with, would be to set their WTO tariff schedule at 0 for everything, or practically everything. Would that be in the UK's interests in the event of no deal?
Thank you. And would you like to say your name for the record?
Sorry, John Buckridge, Evershed, Sutherland.
Thank you. Pascal.
On the first question, again, I totally recognize that my baskets are very approximative. Just to give you, without lecturing you and boring you during 6 hours, because the telephone book would probably last 6 hours to read it. It's just a way to give you a sense of what's at stake. But areas where politics and economics interfere a lot because of sensitivity for public opinion or specific vested constituency interest might look simple and turn in reality to be very complex. So that's at least my experience as a negotiator. And I'm not going to give you a long lecture on philosophy of negotiations, but negotiations are it's an exercise in revealing real preferences. A negotiation always starts hiding your real preferences, trying to guess what the other real preference is, and be quicker at delivering something which is half of the other real preferences with much of your preference. And negotiations only stabilize when, at the end of the day, the price is rationally evaluated on both sides as the right one. On the second question, which is what during the campaign we call the Minford option, which is the sort of ultra-liberal view. Why should we have any obstacle on any import? That's stupid. It increases the Browne. Even Cobden said that at the time for one specific good, which was bread. It's a perfectly rational economic. It happened that politically it doesn't work very well. Not least because your economy is extremely competitive in some areas, a bit less, and the time the bit less are washed out usually lead to a bit of social and political pain. And that tariffs are a way to ease this process. But the real counter-argument of adopting a zero tariff is that it's zero incentive for others to provide you with increased market access. Why should they do that? If they can use your market free, why would they pay anything for that? So that's back to the negotiating stance, which is one of the reasons why you have a WTO and you have bilateral free trade agreements. It may be for some part of economic theory counterintuitive, but that's political realities, and that's the way it works. Although I personally, after some years of experience in trade negotiations, would very much agree with reversing the name of the game. Instead of having trade protections that you remove, which is a complex, lengthy, painful process, including with some of your domestic constituencies, why don't we have it the other way around? Article 1, trade is open. Yeah. Article 2, in some conditions, there may be a good reason to have a few obstacles, and this is why and how we are going to run that. That would change the world. It would make things incredibly simple, and the notion that Article 1 is that trade is open, if that's vetted by your constituency, that people recognize the benefits of trade, although in some cases or with the, but unfortunately we have it upside down.
But I think that should be the underlying mindset of Britain in these negotiations and post-Brexit. It's a very interesting conversation of whether you should only make your economy more competitive and efficient if somebody's willing to do it as part of a deal, or whether you should welcome that as a good in its own end. I just wanted a couple of reflections briefly. Is that Pascal said, well, there is unity among the EU 27. Well, yes, because they haven't actually had to agree anything yet, apart from not say anything to the British until Article 50 is triggered. we will see. I'm not saying to actively seek disunity, but I went to every member state of the EU last year, and I have had this conversation more times than I can recall, where people have lamented to me Britain leaving the European Union because they will be at the mercy of the more protectionist countries within the EU when it comes to the future direction of the EU 27. That the equilibrium on trade, on free market economics will be shifted substantially towards the protectionist end of the scale from Britain being taken off the other end of the scale. So there is that concern expressed in large numbers of member states. And I suppose logically flowing from that, I am certain in my own mind that if our country is to make a success of Brexit and the City of London is to continue to thrive, then we need to be an open, free trading, economically liberal country, both in our negotiations with the EU, but more generally. Otherwise, I think it would be very difficult for us to prosper. But I hope there will be a sense on the other side of the channel that is in both sides' interest.
All right, look, I'm going to come back to both these points because there's giant dangling questions there on both sides. Let me get some more questions in, though. The chap who had the microphone before, and I rudely jumped over him, and then here on the aisle, the lady here on the aisle.
Hi, Ashley Calvin from The Independent. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, yesterday said that the UK has done no economic assessment.
To your mic.
Excuse me, can you speak with the microphone nearer to you, please?
I'm getting older.
Hi, Ashley Calvin from The Independent. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, said yesterday that the UK has done no economic assessment of leaving the EU on WTO terms. Do you think this is irresponsible?
All right, so David Davis said that the UK government had not done. And the next one.
Yes, mine follows up, Patricia Rawlings, House of Lords, follows up very much from that. As head of the WTO, and comes the end of the 2 years, the Prime Minister says, this deal isn't good enough, no deal. So many people tell me, well, the WTO will be the answer. And you've mentioned all the complexities about dealing with the EU. What main complexities will there be with the WTO?
Thank you. Pascal,
Well, I mean, on the first question, I want to remain as objective as possible, but I mean, I think all ministers should read their briefs. And I'm sure he's been provided with a brief that says what happens after 2 years if there's no agreement. So I'm absolutely certain, knowing the quality of the UK civil service, that they have provided their ministers with scenarios of this kind. Now, maybe ministers don't read them, or maybe they don't believe them, but I'm sure the job has been done, and there is an evaluation on the UK side of what will happen if after 2 years, the sort of cliff option, as you say, on this side. We don't call it the cliff option. It's probably because of Dover. I mean,
we do. For probably that reason, we call it the cliff option.
Absolutely, you do, but there is a sort of image there that on the continent, we don't call it this way. There's something there that has to do with pictures, or maybe paintings. And as I said, and that's my answer to the second question, as I said a moment ago, any terms that would be not agreed as WTO plus will, by definition, be WTO, and then and this is minus optimum. And I think, and I believe, that both sides will strive to avoid this situation. Now, it might happen for other reasons. Let's assume there's no compromise between the 40 billion and the 60 billion. Okay, maybe, although the moment you start discussing numbers, that's not, I mean, you can discuss numbers until midnight or 1 minute before midnight. But, so, I really do think that for such a thing to happen, this will have been mishandled on either one side or both sides. But I cannot see this as a sort of, likely scenario.
May I just say, with
the transition, of course.
With the transition, you mean if there is more time?
Yeah. With some drawers which we will have negotiated and which will allow time transition, whatever, continuation. Clause.
Yes. All right, well, let me say something from the IFG perspective on this, as we do a lot of work on Brexit. We're talking very calmly about this extension of the status quo. Yet that's going to need approval by the other European countries at some point. We can't simply assume that it happens, and it may well be in their interest to hold that in suspension, not to make clear whether or not that actually happens for some point. Obviously, there has been some work done, and we know that on on what walking out would look like. But it seems to be what David Davis meant, from what we tell talking to the civil servants who have done some work on it, but it is not that there's not been detailed economic calculations of what that would mean for all parts of the economy, for the reason that you say that many people don't want it. But I'm not rushing to defend David Davis on every point, but I would say that he has read and indeed commissioned the briefs on many of these points. Jeremy, did you have a point to come in on this?
Well, obviously it is possible to trade in WTO. The biggest trading partner of the United Kingdom, single nation state, is the United States, and there's no formal trade agreement in place, and anybody who's tried to buy some goods made in China find that it's perfectly possible to do that in the United Kingdom. But specifically on financial services, it gets harder, and there is a very strong appetite in the City of London for trying to put in place some tailor-made, transitional, sensible relationship which allows a smooth progress from where we are today on financial services interaction with the rest of the continent to an end point out the other side, and to fall off a cliff edge, or however it's described in other countries in Europe, would be disruptive, certainly. Disruptive for the wider European economy as well as for the City of London.
Thank you. All right, the two over by the door, standing up and sitting down.
Hi, Julia Rampin from the New Statesman. Going back to the point you made about Scotland. About Scotland and if it should become independent. So you've talked about a 5 or 6 year trade deal negotiations for the UK as a whole. If someone voted to be in an independent Scotland, what kind of timescale are we talking about before they have any coherent deal?
Well,
Right, and the next question.
Hello, this is Martin Bergfelder, German Embassy. I have a question on the interlinkage of WTO and the Brexit negotiations. You have mentioned already a little bit the schedules that need to be agreed. I'm not an expert at all, so that's my question is, assuming we have problems in the negotiations and a threat of walking away and all, how much is there an interplay with WTO? Can the UK embarrass the EU27 and vice versa on agreeing schedules, for example? Do you foresee a kind of an interplay between these two processes? And can you maybe explain a little bit better how that works? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just go back to the first question. I'm sure Jeremy and Pascal are ahead of me, but I want to be quite sure. You're saying if there is an independent Scotland and it joins the EU, how long would it take for a trade deal?
Yeah.
Or how long would it take for accession?
From the independence vote to actually having a coherent trading agreement with the EU.
Right, so...
Being part of the EU.
Well, those are different things, though. All right.
Let's say for their pledge of being part of the EU.
All right.
Is that?
in the case, assume Scotland becomes independent, wants to join. For reasons which you just gave, we are back to the normal, we have something functional overnight. So, zero technical problem. Maybe the number of votes which Scotland will have in the European Council, the number of Scottish members of the European Parliament will have to be negotiated, okay? Not a problem. The only serious problem, and I'm not a specialist in intra-UK constitutional arrangements, devolution, I have to be very careful about that. The only problem I see on the EU27 is the sensitivity in some member states, like Spain, for instance, that a part of your quote-unquote country goes into secession. And we know that the Spanish government is not that keen in making it clear that Catalonia could join the European Union after having a referendum, which, by the way, they don't agree should take place. It's different from a situation here. That's the real obstacle I would see on this road. On WTO schedules, if you want to sleep at night, don't ever ask this question to trade negotiators. They will take two little simple things and they'll create a knot which will take 10 years to unlock. In theory, true, any member of WTO has to agree to any bit of any of these huge schedules, and if not, there's no agreement. And by the way, if my memory is correct, a number of EU enlargement schedules dating from 2004, I think they were notified in 2005,
that's right.
which is 12 years ago. A number of EU enlargement schedules have not yet been cleared by the WTO system. 12 years later, for reason that somebody in some place has so leave lawyers in a separate room, put politicians and people who roughly know what they are talking about, let them settle this, and then once it's done, you ask lawyers to put it in writing. But don't do it the other way around, it will never work.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question, and apologies, we're going right up against what is definitely a hard exit from this room. Here, in fact, you were very... and I'm going to ask both Jeremy and Pascal to use this question, whatever it might be, as a peg, as a peg, not necessarily as a peg for their last thoughts, please.
So that's a big responsibility. Ed Conway from Sky News. You said earlier on that you feel in these negotiations often the negotiators gravitate towards a position that is kind of getting close to optimal for both sides as a kind of market system that clears. Do personalities actually matter in these cases then? Our foreign minister said over the weekend that no deal would be fine. David Davis said, as you heard yesterday, that there had been no economic assessment about the impact of no deal. Are you confident that these personalities will actually come to an optimal deal, knowing all of that?
Thank you, Jeremy. Personalities.
Stop. Maybe I don't think I'll comment on the personality of the Foreign Secretary. We all have our views. Your views are as valid as mine. I mean, maybe a sort of briefly sort of overview, which is that it is recognised in the EU, it is recognised in the treaties that it is possible for a member state to leave if it wishes to leave. And people can quibble, or they can have strong disagreements about the means by which Britain left. They can think that the debate we had for our referendum was not a great advert for British democracy. Certainly most people in the City of London saw the advantages of Britain staying in the EU. But as I always say, there are advantages as well as disadvantages of living in a democracy. And the result was the result. And I think it is beholden on all parties, including the EU 27, to recognise the legitimacy of a member state leaving and to seek to try and put that into effect with maximum efficiency and minimum discord, and to try and develop the best relationship possible. I mean, as a thought exercise, if Britain had never belonged to the EU, would people in the EU think it was a good idea to have a strong relationship with the biggest and most important country on the continent of Europe outside the EU? The answer is self-evidently yes. And it seemed to me that as a country, we've never been fully reconciled to our membership of the European Union. We would either have voted narrowly to stay in and then sought to opt out of every single manifestation of federalism for the next 20 years. Or, as it happened, we voted narrowly to leave and will now want to have a very close working relationship with the organisation that we just voted to leave. In other words, we always fear being left behind by the EU, and we fear being consumed by the EU. And maybe it's better that rather than having a disagreeable sometimes and occasionally irritating internal partner in the UK, that the EU 27 thinks, why don't we have a friendly external relationship? In other words, they make a move from seeing Britain as a sort of internal disciplinary problem and start seeing Britain as an external relationship building opportunity. And if that shift is made, I think we can have a perfectly good working agreement, and that would work for the City of London, which, as I say, is hosted by Britain. And there are good reasons why the City of London is here. If the ideal place for financial services on the continent of Europe was Paris, it would be in Paris already. There's nothing stopping people from going there. The reason it's come to London is for a whole host of reasons which make London a compelling centre for global finance on this continent. But it's a centre for global finance that serves this whole continent. As I say, Britain hosts the City of London, but the City of London is a hyper-internationalised centre. It's almost the manifestation of the argument that Europe can be more than the sum of its parts. You can see if you walk around the City of London. And the question for us is, how can we carry on being one of Europe's prized global assets? We have 7% of the world's population on this continent, so we shouldn't be little Europeans. 93% of the people in the world don't live here. They look at Europe from the outside. What do they see and admire that we do better than elsewhere in the world? And the City of London is a perfect example of that. And it's very much our hope that the politicians can put into effect the referendum in the most mature and cordial way possible, and the City of London can continue to be a beacon for success which helps the whole of Europe.
Jeremy, thank you for that pitch. And Pascal, can I bring you back? Actually, this important question Ed Conway has asked about personalities and how much difference they make in all this.
Yeah, I mean, let me be frank. What will save you from the provocations of good old Boris, which I happen to know very well, because Stanley Johnson, his father, was living very near to where we used to live when we were both living
you knew the young
in
Boris.
Belgium. So I saw Boris as a nasty young kid, and he never changed. But what will save you from the provocations of Boris is that we credit the British with a very specific aptitude to eccentricity. Imagine somebody from Sweden or the Netherlands behaving like Boris. There'll be total explosion. But he's a Brit, and these people, have their own. They have their own traditions. They have their own specificity, and sometimes it's very funny. And the guy is very funny, by the way. So that's why I don't think it will be a problem. And anyhow, if he's too much of a talented provocator, Theresa May will balance it on the other side.
Pascal, I'm just going to stop you for a second. Knowing how these things have a life, and you said all kinds of intelligent and thoughtful things today, and these are remarks about Boris are likely to hang there in the ether after you've gone there. This is your view of Boris.
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem. These are serious issues, and they go over political cycles, changes of personalities. No doubt about that. What you just said about UK finally reaching a sort of balance reminds me of the definition of Brexit, which was given by a good friend of mine, Jean-Louis Bourlange, who was a very talented member of the European Parliament, who said, Brexit is a big change. Before Brexit, they had a foot in and a foot out. And now they have a foot out and a foot in. That's the big change. That's exactly the definition. And finally, to come back to my question about costs, which I still believe, I'm not saying economics will always trump politics. I'm saying economics matter. And the example you gave at the beginning, which is Russia or Czechoslovakia, are indeed interesting examples, but they had zero cost, which will not be the case for Brexit.
Okay, well, look, thank you for that. Let me just give you my final afterthought, which is that we've had this, a fascinating and extensive conversation, and much of it focusing on how this is going to happen and what indeed the costs are going to be and so on. Hanging over it all is the politics, and it seems we have this kind of rather quiet, technocratic 9 months, but the politics is about to explode over this once the two sides actually begin negotiating, and I think that's the significance of this last point. Thank you all. Thank you to the City of London. We have a series of these events, in fact, with the City. The next one, the next public one here, is on April the 19th here at the IFG, where we'll look at how to approach negotiations with Sir Andrew Khan, Stephen Laws and Teresa Villiers. Can you join me in thanking the panel? Thank you.